Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous? Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Inky, pinky, parlez-vous?
First of all, I'd like to say thank you very much to David for inviting me to speak again. Always very happy to come along and highlight aspects of the importance of intelligence within the First World War history. So my talk tonight is about James Cuffe, a mid-ranking intelligence officer who is not especially famous. Before now, he's really only appeared briefly in a few works, mine included, and then very often only in relation to some of the espionage work that he did in, espionage-related work that he did in 1914. And he's not somebody who went on to greater things. I'll highlight an example of one of those later on. So this is somebody who was up until recently, only known to a few sort of deep specialists like me. In 2013, I published the book of my PhD, a book called Haig's Intelligence, and Cuffe got a few mentions in there. And 3 years later, after the publication of the book, somebody was Googling their grandfather's name, and because his name had appeared within my book, they got a hit on my book. And long story short, they got in touch with me and said that the family was still in possession of some documents which James Cuffe had retained from the First World War. Now, of course, I was very interested to hear that these sources had survived. And Cuffe's grandson very kindly allowed me to photograph them. And because of their historical significance, the documents have now been posited in the Imperial War Museum. Now, as well as sort of bits of ephemera related to his military service, at the core of this are 45 memorandum that were written by Cuffe. Again, Cuffe, it depends on the pronunciation. Written by him between December 1916 and May 1918. And I'll be honest and say, within a few minutes of looking at them, I realised that they were a pretty rare historical source. And the reason is that our understanding of intelligence assessments in the period for General Headquarters is very much limited by the sources that have survived. So the surviving intelligence documentation tends to be either the sort of the daily intelligence summary, which is the sort of the raw material of the intelligence system, and occasionally you will get assessments that are written by the head of intelligence, which feed into the operational planning process. So in some ways, what we've got is the sort of the inputs for the intelligence, and we've got the outputs, but what we don't really have is what is happening inside the intelligence box at GHQ. How are the sausages being made? We're seeing the input, and we're seeing the output. What's happening in between? And what got me very excited about these memos was that they were internal memos. Written by Cuffe to the head of the intelligence section, and they are therefore unique in that regard. They are the kind of documents that would normally be ephemeral, that would not survive on file. So I resolved at the time that I would try and find some way of bringing them to further light in some sort of publication. And after a couple of sort of false starts, eventually that publication became a chapter in Spencer Jones's 1917 edited volume. And I expect that some members of the audience will be familiar with the book series that Spencer has been editing. And I contributed to the 1916 volume with a chapter on British intelligence in relation to the Battle of Verdun, and it seemed a logical outlet for these memorandums. So what I do within the chapter, and it's chapter 5 within a much wider volume with lots of other things going on, is I introduce James. I talk through the body of the memoranda, and then for the main part, I then go through chronologically looking at his assessments in relation to the German retreat to the Hindenburg Line, Battle of Arras, Third Ypres, and the German offensives in the first half of 1918. And it's the Third Ypres section that I've sort of selected as a sort of taster for you in this talk tonight. By coincidence, I discovered very recently that the book has been reviewed on the Great War Forum, and although the review only had a little bit to say about my chapter, it was very, very positive about the other chapters. I see from a quick check this afternoon that Amazon are discounting the book to 26 quid. So there's an opportunity if you want to sort of click the buy now button and see not only my work but also other people's work as well. And I can attest to the fact there are some very, very interesting chapters in the rest of the volume. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about James himself, talk about how intelligence was done in 1917, and in particular how analysis was organized within GHQ. And then I want to talk a little bit about two specific instances where we can see James having an effect on the way things are done within GHQ during Third Ypres. Now, I'm not going to sort of pretend that there's a sort of massive game-changing discovery here, but what we do see is that this adds a great deal of interest and nuance to our understanding of how a couple of particular operational decisions are made. So, beginning with James himself. So, when the First World War breaks out, James is in his late 30s. He's an Irishman. He's a Roman Catholic. His father was a magistrate in Ireland. He joins the Marines. He does very normal things out with the Royal Navy, with the fleet. He has a period seconded to East Africa, and he qualifies as an interpreter in a couple of languages. Now, up to this point, none of that is remarkable. There are lots of officers in the army who have done these things. But then his career takes an unusual turn. And why is this? Well, almost certainly it's due to the intervention of this man, George MacDonogh. In 1912, he took over as head of what today would be called the intelligence management section of the War Office. It's called MO5, the MO5 Special Section, and it has responsibility for sort of organizing intelligence architecture. It has a responsibility for making intelligence preparations for war, etc. And MacDonogh is not new to this work. He's been working as a subordinate within that field before he takes over the top job in sort of intelligence management. And as you can see, this provides the platform catapult him to the highest jobs in intelligence. He goes on the outbreak of war, he goes to be the head of GHQ intelligence, and then in the middle of the war, when Douglas Haig takes over, at the end of 1915, when Douglas Haig takes over at GHQ, he goes off to London to become the Director of Military Intelligence. He then makes a move to become one of the Army's more senior officers as the Adjutant General at the end of 1918. Now, why does he intervene? Well, it's fairly straightforward. He is James's second cousin, and unsurprisingly, he takes an interest in the military career of his younger relative. And this sort of family connection is not unusual in the army in this period. And although it has some positive effects for James, it also creates a certain amount of negatives because the familial connection is quite well known within the intelligence system. And there is sometimes, perhaps on the part of some of his more jealous peers, an assumption that he didn't really get the job on merit. However, his postings are not necessarily out of kilter with of his staff officer peer group. So I think probably on balance, it's both good and bad for James. So what did George MacDonald do? Well, it would appear that he gets James seconded to the Secret Service. More on that in a moment. Then, by the end of 1914, James is working for GHQ Intelligence, and assisted by George, he is making the process of transferring from the Navy to the Army to the Royal Munster Fusiliers, which takes place in 1915. He then goes off to do counterintelligence work at Third Army. He does a short staff course in the winter of 1915-1916, and then he goes as an extra officer to Fourth Army for the first part of the Somme. And then in September 1916, he is called back to GHQ, where he takes on the role which is the one I'm talking about. Middle of 1918, he moves to Foch's headquarters, and then after the armistice, becomes part of the Armistice Commission. 1919, he becomes commanding officer of one of the Royal Munster Fusiliers battalions and takes them to Upper Silesia. However, the Irish regiments are disbanded in 1922, and James's career hits the buffers really in terms of his career. He retires to Winchester. He becomes involved in local politics and ends up commanding a Home Guard battalion during the Second World War, and he later died in 1957. So that's his sort of career overview. Let's now go back to the interesting bit, which is his time seconded to the service. Now, quite a lot of what he is up to is shrouded in mystery. Because unlike all the other government records related to the First World War, the SIS records for the First World War are still classified. However, we can, from the material that is in the public domain, plus corroboration from James's ephemera within James's papers, so we can corroborate and piece together a little bit of what he's doing. And so, for example, this is his Belgian touring club card, which gives us some quite interesting dates and addresses and that sort of thing. So we can verify it fits with other pieces of the jigsaw that we have for them. So James's primary role seems to have been collation of information about southern Belgium that would have been useful to the British Army in the event of war. So what we see is him touring around the country, gathering information about locations and individuals, and there are documents surviving in the archives, works of reference related to Belgium, for which he is a plausible author from that. And it seems to have been envisaged that, based on the preparations that James is doing, plus the preparations being done by other operatives of the Secret Service, that there would be a network of agents would be recruited, and once their positions have been sort of overrun by the Germans, they would report using the normal postal system back to France. And James would not be sort of running the agent networks. There were other people who would do that in the event of war. But he seems to have been envisaged to be the sort of the liaison officer between GHQ and the Secret Service during sort of the opening phase of the war. Now, in theory, this all works based on the war which the army thinks it's going to fight. But the problem is that the Germans don't have the script. And instead of carrying out a sort of shallow right flanking move through the Ardennes, they punch through Liège and very quickly flood out across central Belgium. Now, along with other Secret Service operatives, James had gone to Brussels a few days before the war started to sort of make the sort of various operations. And in accordance with what we envisage his role to be, once the BEF is concentrating in France, he then rushes back to liaise with GHQ, meets up with some intelligence officers, and pushes on to Charleroi and Namur to find out what's going on in front of the BEF. And interestingly, his sort of personal reconnaissance reports corroborate reports from the Royal Flying Corps that the Germans are approaching the BEF in rather large numbers. What happens next isn't quite clear. The documentary evidence is a bit fragmentary. There seems to be, during the retreat from Mons and subsequently, a suggestion that he might go back undercover to Brussels, but instead he seems to be taking on some sort of intelligence liaison role or some sort of espionage management role while based at a French army headquarters. And unfortunately, it's a little bit vague. Okay, so that's his background, and specifically where he is in the intelligence system at the beginning. I now want to sort of move on to James's main wartime work, which is doing intentions analysis of GHQ from late 1916 through to mid 1918. Now, this coincides with one of the BEF's most important engagements. So, memoranda gives some interesting insight into how the BEF perceived its enemy. Now, before I get into the sort of the specifics of what James is doing, I want to summarize some aspects of intelligence collection to give you some idea of what it was possible for them to know. So, good analysis relies to a great extent upon good collection. So how did the BEF know things about the German army on the Western Front? Well, at a basic level, there are frontline observation systems. You are looking out with binoculars and seeing what the enemy is doing. You are also interacting with the enemy in that you are taking prisoners, you're capturing deserters, you are searching the enemy for documents, you are looking at debris on the battlefields. This is very much sort of old-fashioned intelligence collection. But what we see by 1917 is that you're doing this now on a sort of near industrial scale. And particularly by 1917, the interrogation system has shaken out. You've realized that German officers are a bit of a dead end. They're not going to talk. So later on in 1918, you move to bugging their accommodation. The private soldiers generally don't really know what's going on, so the focus of the interrogation system tends to be finding bright non-commissioned officers and seeing what they can tell you. So this is providing a huge volume of material in terms of that sort of contact interaction between the British Army and the German Army. Espionage, old-fashioned way of collecting intelligence, and the cartoon that you can see there is a depiction of the idea of a sort of single spy who's managed to get themselves into a position where they can sort of gain access to the enemy's plans. And there is a certain amount of sort of fairly sort of conventional reporting from agents in neutral countries and often also from fraudsters who pretend that they are in enemy countries. And what is very clear from comments within the memoranda is that James is particularly skeptical of this type of reporting, and it is clear, with benefit of hindsight, that the Germans are using the sort of single agents in neutral and supposedly in hostile countries as a conduit. The reality of the British espionage system in 1917 is that it's much more mundane and also much more impressive. That the reality is actually large networks of agents within occupied France and in Belgium who are focused very much on monitoring train movements and German rest areas, And again, we're talking here about, teams of dozens of agents turning into networks that number hundreds. And although in 1917 the coverage is not complete, it is very, very good on most of the main railway networks in Belgium. And so this provides very, very good information on any large-scale movement of German troops. Furthermore, you've also got a source that really begins to mature in 1917, and that is signals intelligence. The Germans had pivoted towards wireless communications during their battles, and this provides many, many opportunities for you to for the British to carry out interception and analysis of the German radio signals. And you don't necessarily, although you do code breaking, a lot of what you are able to gather as useful information comes from analysis of the networks and sort of looking at the traffic and sort of conducting traffic analysis rather than actually sort of reading messages. And then when overlaid upon other sources, this is quite useful in terms of providing indications of German activities and sometimes German intentions. It's a similar story with air photography. By 1917, the system of air photography is running well. It's not as good as it will be in 1918, but it does have good cameras. It's got decent processes, and it's got a growing capacity to be able to analyze what is happening. Now, part of what's going on in 1917 is that the British and their allies don't have such good air superiority as they do in 1918. So you're pushing against a stronger German air force at this point. But there is very, very good material coming from air photography, and particularly as you'll see, given James's remit for analysis, air photography is absolutely crucial to what he's doing. So all of this collection which has developed is feeding into the intelligence system at various levels, but at the apex of the system is GHQ intelligence. And what you're looking at here is a picture of some of the GHQ intelligence staff at advanced GHQ in the summer of 1917. So this is where GHQ moves to huts closer to the battlefront. And we've got the head of GHQ intelligence, John Charters, a very controversial figure, who is there front and center of the picture. And Charters has various intelligence sections working for him. So, for example, Section IB does espionage and counter-espionage. Section IE does signals intelligence. But the most important subsection of the intelligence section is IA, which does analysis on the German army. And hopefully, for the purposes of my talk, this photograph, we have two chief analysts in IA in 1917, James and another James Cornwall. There is another major in IA who does the dissemination intelligence, but these two are the most important. So how did they divide up their work? Well, our James is responsible primarily for assessing German intentions, and as part of that portfolio, he is looking at defences and rear areas, hence the importance of air photography to his work, and also strategic movement. So again, linking there into the output of the agent networks. Whereas James Cornwall is focused on the order of battle of the German forces, where they are, how they're recruiting their forces, etc. So this is sort of two sides to the coin. Now, it's also sort of worth noting in passing that up till now, our understanding of what's going on in IA has been skewed to a certain extent by the fact that James Cornwall went on to have a sort of fairly glittering military career, lived well into his 90s, wrote a lot of books about the First World War, and also through oral history interviews and his books, sort of put the knife into Charters and got his version of the story well established by pretty much from the 1960s onwards. So one of the nice things about James's memoranda is that they bring a different perspective to what is going on inside IA. Okay, so now for my last part, moving on to Third Ypres. So infamous battle that often popularly referred to as Passchendaele. Lots of historical and emotional baggage connected to the battle, and the photos that I put here give you some sense of the battlefield conditions in the early and also the later stages of the battle. Now, there are two moments in this battle where I think James's involvement is interesting. First of all, before the start of the infantry attack, or before the start of the artillery attack as well, in the planning of the offensive, when he's involved indirectly in the planning process. Well, we can prove indirect, but I suspect also direct. And then also in the middle of the battle, when everything has gone rather wrong, and we see James trying to persuade his superiors to completely reorientate the direction of the offensive. So again, with this audience, I'm assuming that I don't need to unpack this too much. This map is numbered, so showing you first of all the first line, number 2 being the front line after the Messines operation, number 3 being the where the front line is after Fifth Army's succession of unsuccessful operations up to mid-August. Then you've got the period of Second Army doing their bite and hold through to the 13th of October, and then the final phase up onto the Passchendaele Ridge for number 5. Okay, so if we back up to the period after Messines, there is a great deal of discussion within GHQ about how the next phase is going to play out. Well, how are you going to conduct the offensive at Ypres in the first instance? The centre of this debate is John Davidson, who's the head of operations at GHQ. Now, Fifth Army are going to be carrying out the operation, and they envisaged a deep penetration into the German lines, which, if successful, might capture the high ground up onto the Passchendaele Ridge, and therefore permit then the sort of the wider operations for the offensive to sort of clear the Belgian coast, etc. Now, Davidson sort of looks at, again, I'm giving you a very, very broad brush précis here. Davidson looks at Fifth Army's original concept of operations and tries to adopt or tries to press a much more cautious approach. And in late June, the point at which decisions have to be made, the debate boils down to how deep the day one objective should be. And whereas Fifth Army wants to go 3 miles deep, Davidson is pretty much advocating only a mile. And he writes a lengthy memorandum, which is reproduced in the official history, which criticises Fifth Army's plans. And subsequently, this has become, this debate between Fifth Army and GHQ, centred around Davidson's memorandum, has been absolutely crucial to all debates about whether or not Haig is seeking a breakthrough, or whether he's seeking a sort of methodical bite and hold, and whether or not this connection between Fifth Army and GHQ is fatally flawed. So if we're looking at if we go back to the map, if we're looking at the map to give you a rough idea of the scale, sort of Ypres to Passchendaele is sort of 6 miles. So Fifth Army is in very, very broad terms looking to get halfway to Passchendaele on day 1, and is also looking to capture the high ground immediately to the east of Ypres here on the Gehelvelt Plateau. Now there are what we then see, what we see within James's involvement is at the same time that this debate is going on, GHQ intelligence, or internally GHQ intelligence, this is material that James is pushing up to charters, and therefore, based on what we know about charters' attendance at various key meetings, we can presume that this is being fed in. Is that and I unpack this more in more detail in the chapters, but I've sort of very much given you the highlights here. But the key conclusion is that they sort of hedge a bit within the intelligence assessment, in that they sort of take the view that something in between would be possible. However, what we also see in the rest of James's memorandum is a very clear statement that at this point, at the end of June, what he is seeing from air photography and other sources is that the German rear defences past that sort of halfway mark are very much underdeveloped, which, if you like, tips the argument more towards Fifth Army's position, which is if you can give the Germans a really hard push, you can then break into the rear of the German position where their defences are less well developed. So if we're talking here the Gelbe-Langemark line, if we're looking at that on the map, again, you can see that's the sort of the halfway point. So if we like, the general tone in the memo here is, yes, 3,000 is probably manageable against the Germans. And by the way, if you push hard, beyond that, the German defence is not very well prepared. Now, of course, though, the problem is that the Germans have a month to change that situation, and the Germans do their best to change that situation. And these operational decisions are being made. The Germans have then got a month to improve their defensive positions. So what we see shortly before the infantry attack at the end of July is James reassessing the situation, and I mean, he's pointing to damage to the German defences, but he's also hedging by pointing out that they have increased their wire. In other parts of the memorandum, he talks about the strong points that they have developed further, and quite oddly, he sees a water obstacle as potentially being more of a hindrance to the Germans than it will be to the British. As I say, these are sort of short summary quotes. For those of you who are deeply into this, there are more details in the chat. Anyway, as many of these audience I'm sure will know, first levy of 30 doesn't take any deep objectives, and then the rain begins to fall. And Fifth Army spends the first half of August engaged in fruitless attempts to move forward. And as talked about before, the line number 3 is pretty much where they've got to by the mid-August period. What we see during this time is James writing 4 memos to charters, all of which have a unifying theme, which is to try and find something which will unlock the German defensive system. And he sort of prefaces a lot of this by saying that the BEF only has a 6-week window to defeat the Germans. And this is because of the logic that operations on the Eastern Front will stop in early October due to weather. And at that point, that will free up German resources from the Eastern Front to be able to shift to the West. So what is James's suggestion? Well, the conclusion that he comes to is that something radical needs to be done. And again, without unpacking all of this in excruciating detail, this is based on his analysis of the configuration of the German defensive system. And what he argues in these 4 memoranda with sort of increasing amounts of evidence is that what the BEF needs to do is to switch the axis from, instead of going east-northeast, is to go south-southwest towards Zandvoort. And once you have done that, you will force the Germans to, because it will then therefore make the defences to the south of there untenable. And again, he sees that the orientation of the German defences in this area have been undermined primarily because of the success of the earlier Messines operation. And that once you make that push, you will dislocate the German defences, which will then allow you to attack northwards on to the high ground to the east of Ypres. Now, again, you know, I don't want to go into too much detail of this, but this is very much argued from the point of view of you know, of analysis of the German defensive positions. Now, it's impossible to know whether or not this would have, you know, it's very much a great big what if. But what we do know is that this suggestion was taken very seriously at the end of August, and we know this because the Chief of Staff of the Fifth Army records that it was decided for a GHQ that Zandvoort would become a target for Second Army. However, what we then see once Second Army actually takes over the operation is that they do their own analysis and of German defences, state of the ground, etc., and come to the conclusion that actually this is not a viable option. Now that of course is interesting in itself, but I don't necessarily have time to unpack that. I can maybe talk about that in questions. So, having sort of given you a very, very brief taster for what's in the chapter, I just want to sort of make conclude with some reflections before the questions. First of all, and I would say this as an intelligence historian, intelligence matters. Too often we rely on reinterpreting the same old operational sources rather than reconstructing the mental world that is created by the intelligence picture. If we understand what the decision makers perceived, then operational decisions start to make more sense. Secondly, understanding systems and processes is important. The middle-ranking people and the sources that they leave behind are, I think, as significant, very often more so, than the higher level commanders' diaries and correspondence, simply because the middle-ranking people are not necessarily you know, recording sources with an eye to posterity or their reputation. And thirdly, which was sort of rammed home for me very much by the experience of reading James's memos for the first time, is that I'm always optimistic that there is fresh evidence out there waiting to be found. And although it's very challenging to integrate new pieces into the jigsaw, it has to be done. Otherwise, we don't bring in nuance and we end up with fairly old, stale debates. So, final message, if you want to know more about James or about other aspects of the BEF in 1917, then please buy the book. And it just leaves me to say thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Jim, thanks very much indeed. That was extremely insightful and very interesting. It's always good to get an insight into the intelligence side of the war, something that we don't often touch on, so thanks for that. Ladies and gentlemen, if in the usual manner we can do a silent round of applause by pressing the raise hand button. Jim, I can confirm, although you can't see it, that there's lots of hands going up, which is our way of doing a round of applause in a virtual manner. So thanks for that presentation. It's Q&A time now, so what I'd like to do is invite people to tap into the Q&A button. Any questions they might have for Jim. I'll kick off just whilst people are typing in with just observing, is it Charteris or Charters?
Okay, right. So so this is one of the ones which, and this is also whether it's Cuffe or Cuffe. So one of the really good sources for work, because if you look at style guides of the time, for both of those style guides of the time say you can use either. One of the best sources, however, are the American visitors and liaison officers who record the names incorrectly because they've been introduced. This is General Charters, and then in their report that they write that evening, they say, "I spoke to General Charters."
Yeah, the type it phonetically.
Yeah, similarly, also, there is, I spoke to Major Cuffe. Now again, that's still open to interpretation, because it could be that they didn't find out who it was and they saw the name and it was their interpretation. So it's without getting our time machine and going back to find out what it was. It's on the balance of probabilities. It's Charters. But on Cuffe, the evidence is less voluminous, so I'm hedging my bets on that one.
Perfect, thanks for that. I must admit, if I did have a time machine, as interesting as Charters or Chartresses, I think I'd get into the time machine and probably ask a few more questions besides interpreting the pronunciation of words, of names. So we've got a question in from John. Fire away.
Okay, hi Jim. Fairly basic question. Do you have any idea how it came about that James Cuffe kept these documents? Presumably this was quite unofficial.
Yeah, I don't have a definitive answer to that. I've got sort of, but partly they're not. The collection is not complete. There are 45 memos. They come in batches. There are periods where there are no memos. I think it's very much a decision on his part to retain some of them that he saw as most significant. There are some for 1918 where we know from the reports of the American liaison officer at GHQ that he wrongly interprets a couple of things, and there's no memos for that. So I think that first of all, that there is a selective retention, which is unfortunate, because there would be, there are lots of bits that I would be very interested in. Why is he keeping them? I think partly, this stuff just sort of accumulates in the drawer, and he potentially sort of retains them out of sort of interest for out of sort of interest for what he created, maybe with an eye to the future history. A more cynical explanation is that John Charters gets deeply embedded in some political infighting in which the assessments that have been made by GHQ become part of the debate. So, John Charters, misleading Haig is the accusation. James is he's got a sort of ringside seat for this. I wonder whether it's also about having a sort of an insurance policy that if he's ever challenged as to what he said, well, actually, this is what I wrote, because these are ephemeral documents. These are not ones that are going to go on file. These are ones that are going to be internally circulated within the intelligence section, and are not going to live on beyond that. So it's either an eye for posterity or it's an insurance policy. That's my best guess.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that. Chris, do you want to unmute yourself there?
Yeah, thanks, Jim. Thanks for your presentation. It's perhaps a broader question rather than just on Major James, but what evidence is there that there was red teaming going on against British and Allied operational planning? And if there was any evidence of it, did it prove to be effective, either in reality or in hindsight?
Okay, and this is something which again I sort of touch on in the chapter and in the footnotes of the chapter that links to previous work which I've done on this as well. Things don't strike me as particularly joined up in what we would understand in a sort of modern way of doing things. The siloing between what James is doing and what James Cornwall are doing concerns me slightly. there is also the issue, which is that German tactical doctrine and understanding that is not really part of the intelligence section's remit. And we see that what evolves into being the doctrine writers, which grows out of the operations section, seem to be taking much more of an interest in how the Germans are going about doing their operational business on the battlefield. Now, whether that's something that could have been joined up within the sort of the structures and practices of the First World War, I'm not sure, and I'm not even sure if when we get to the Second World War, that this sort of thing has been properly developed. So I'm slightly reticent to sort of project backwards modern practices, but there are sort of structural disconnects which would look odd to modernize.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for that question. I'm not going to take the questions in order because I'm going to introduce now John Spencer Silver, who, well, unmute yourself, John, and we'll explain why I'm introducing John Spencer Silver right now.
Well, Jim, I was just going to say the name, my grandfather's surname was definitely pronounced Cuffe, and as in rhyming with tough. And so that was really all I had to say. But that was definitely, and I was going to say also there are several Cuffes actually watching this tonight.
Right.
So
well, thanks for that. So everybody, this is Major Cuffe's grandson. So thanks for joining in and correcting the pronunciation. Okay, let's go back to where were we? David Muir.
Thanks, Jim, for a very interesting talk. And you said you based your book, Haig's Intelligence, on your PhD thesis, and obviously this adds more evidence to what you would have available when you wrote your PhD. And as is normal with a PhD, new evidence comes up. Would what you found with Major Cuffe's memoranda have altered any of the conclusions you drew in your PhD, or would it just have added to them?
I think, as I do in the chapter, what I'm able to do in the chapter is add in additional sort of nuances. There are extra jigsaw pieces, some of which add additional nuance, some of which are the sort of missing piece that create the link. It's particularly useful in regard to the German offensives of 1918, which is where the sort of the intentions section really does earn its key. It's difficult to say because since over the last decade there's been lots and lots of other things that I've come across, and very much the work as it was then is superseded in lots and lots of different areas, and maybe one day I'll be able to rewrite it, but at the moment it has to sort of go there. But it definitely is an enhancement. There was nothing that that made me say, right, okay, I got that hugely wrong, but it did confirm a few things that I had suspected.
Thank you.
Thanks, David. Thanks for that. Let's go to Michael Lucas now.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the interesting presentation. Did James have any involvement in the succession of attacks on regarding the farms facing Fresenberg in late August, early September. Did he contribute in any way to that?
That period is one of the gaps in the memoranda, and again, I would, because GHQ is doing the big picture stuff, that's the kind of thing that I would be looking now. If I was trying to find out about that, I'd be looking more down at the army level rather than at GHQ. So during the offensive, GHQ is very much doing the sort of the big picture stuff, and this is part of the sort of perennial problem of the Somme and Third Ypres and the offensives in between, which is that GHQ is allowing the armies freedom to do what they want, but then interfering in other stuff. But yeah, I think that will be a level below where James is working.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Michael. Glyn, fire away.
First thing, Jim, thanks for the presentation. I'll be placing my order for the book tomorrow because I know a few of the authors of the other chapters too. No, my question is actually, it's a bit of a lead on from the very first question you were asked. How much did James Cuffe know about German defence in depth? Because on the 31st of July, the eventual Fifth Army plan, actually in the centre, the crucial centre, which was the shortest route to the Passchendaele Ridge, they did manage to capture the Gellivelt-Langemarck line, but they were swept away by the counterattack element of defence in depth. How much was that forecast by intelligence or translated through ops maybe to the operational plans?
Yeah, this is where, linking up to one of my previous answers, where that kind of analysis of we do X, they do Y, action reaction is not really within the remit of the intelligence section at GHQ. We see some of this being discussed within the operations section. This is so previous work I did on the sort of the doctrine section that grew out of operations at the end of 1917 is starting to look at those sorts of things. I also suspect, but I can't prove yet because I've got to do sort of further work, is that when we get down to army level, and particularly Second Army, because the documentation, surviving documentation is better, that sort of analysis and that sort of so what will become clearer. But I don't see that sort of joined upness, to use that phrase, within the GHQ analysis. Partly because again the way in which the remits are given. That doesn't fall under Cornwall's job description. Doesn't fall under James's job description. It's the kind of thing which falls under the operations section.
Okay, thanks, Jim.
Thanks for your question, Leslie. Right, we've just got a couple of final questions to deal with. So let's take Paul McDowell's question. Paul can't get his camera to work, so I'll read it out for him. Paul asks, did Major Cuffe have any inkling of the coming storm, i.e. the offensive about to take place, the spring offensive in 1918?
Yes, absolutely. And that's where his work is probably at its most interesting, and is the final part of the chapter. So I'll just leave that as a yes and recommend the book.
It's a good hook for if you want to find out more, read the book. Yeah, that's grand. We've got a question coming from Facebook, so thanks to everybody who's watching on Facebook. Murray asks this: Cuffe was originally a Royal Marine. Was his transfer to the Army on leaving the SIS because the Army would not accept a Marine in a senior role, or the Admiralty not prepared to help the Army?
Okay, so he's at that point, for the military officers who are associated with at least those so when he goes in 1912 to this new Secret Service organization, he is on secondment. So it is envisaged that he will spend from 1912 to 1915 on secondment working for the Secret Service. And both the Navy and the Army have officers either earmarked for that sort of work or doing that sort of work. So the decision to transfer to the Army is, I think, more about career development based on the sort of suggestions from George McDonough, rather than it is quite feasible that he could have continued as a staff officer within the BEF as a Marine. There were Marines who did that, only a small number, but that would have been quite feasible. I think it's more a sort of sense of, okay, in the long term, you are probably better off in the Army, and therefore now is a good time to make that move. He may have been considering it beforehand. He may have considered an Irish infantry regiment before he joined the Marines. I don't know from the evidence that I've seen. So I think it's more with the sort of long-term goal, and some of the family, some of the sort of family correspondence would sort of very much suggest that it's with an eye to the future rather than needing to do that in order to continue in the role that he's doing.
Good. Right. Thanks for that, Jim. Thanks for that full answer. That's it, folks. We've dried up on the questions. It's been a very interesting presentation by Jim, which I've thoroughly enjoyed. And as I said before, it's good to have a look at the role of intelligence. And we certainly had a look underneath that particular stone this evening with a very interesting case study. So in a time-honored manner, a final round of applause, please, for Jim via the raising hand button. And Jim, I know you can't hear it, and I know you can't see the hands being raised, but we've got hundreds of hands going up as a thank you. So that's all for tonight, folks. We've got we'll go again in a couple of weeks' time with another webinar. So if you've not registered already, please do so. And it just leaves me to say, Jim, thanks very much indeed for your time. It's much appreciated.
No, thank you very much for the opportunity, and thank you, John, for the correction.
Thanks. And a final word on the book. If just give us the title again.
It's called The Darkest Year.
On Amazon, discounted. It's got to be a bargain. Right. Thanks very much, Jim, and thanks everybody for joining us this evening. Thanks and good night.
Mademoiselle.